Welcome to the RNL Revolution Nothing Less Show, episode 23, August 28th, 2020. My name is Andy Zee. I'm the host of the show, and I am recording today in Los Angeles, California. The RNL show is a show that refuses to accept all the unnecessary suffering in the world today. A show that brings out the root cause of all this suffering, whether from climate change, wars, oppression of people because of the color of their skin, their gender, or the country in which they were born. Bringing alive why all this is unnecessary because it is rooted in a system, capitalism, imperialism, a system that has long since outlived its usefulness to humanity. This is a show that brings you a movement that is preparing and organizing today for the time when an actual revolution could be made and actually won, clearing the ground of the system and all of its institutions so that we can bring into being a radically new and far different and far better society where people could collectively go to work on emancipating all of humanity. There is nothing bigger, harder, or more complex or more liberating in changing the face of everything to create a world where people everywhere could really flourish than making revolution here in the U.S. And if you think for more than half a minute, you realize that to win an actual revolution, to overthrow this system that we live under and replace it with a radically new system in government requires leadership. Far-sighted, reality-based leadership. We bring that scientific leadership to you every week in the work and the method and approach of the revolutionary leader, Bob Avakian. Bob Avakian, B.A., came out of the 1960s and over decades has developed a whole body of work, books and films that deeply explain where the problems we face come from, what the strategy is for getting out of this mess, what methods and approaches need to be applied so that the struggle to make revolution and go forward from there to free humanity stays on track so that we really can build a better world, to build a society that human beings would want to live in. And all of this work we call the new communism. And at the heart of this work is a thoroughly and consistently scientific, which means reality-based, method and approach to knowing and changing the world. That is not how any of the other political leaders who dominate our society and the world approach things, as they always have to mold their opinion and their thinking to either get in on or to serve the oppressive system that destroys lives and crushes spirits. And today's science is under attack, perhaps a fatal attack. A reality-based approach to the world and to society we live in hangs in the balance with the epitome of anti-science, the Trump-Pence regime fighting with all they've got and determined to do whatever it takes to bludgeon and consolidate their fascist rule over this country in the battle over the 2020 election. Fascism always comes first by destroying the truth. And this is Trump. Lies, myth-making, conspiracy, the stock in trade to bring about their brutal and, yes, terroristic rule. Now, over the past few episodes, we've featured a critical statement issued by Bob Avakian on August 1st. The statement is titled, "On the Immediate Critical Situation, the Urgent Need to Drive Out the Fascist Trump-Pence Regime, Voting in this Election, and the Fundamental Need for Revolution." This statement gets to the heart of the grave danger humanity faces from this regime, what makes it fascist, and the meaning that has for the future. It is a strategic orientation for the coming period, the kind of struggle that is necessary and the role of voting in this election. And what all of this has to do with the fundamental need for revolution and the work of revolutionaries today. The battle to drive the Trump-Pence fascist regime from power now, with the national protests called by Refuse Fascism on September 5th, are going to be the main subject of today's show. I'm here with Sunsara Taylor, my co-host. So how are you doing? Welcome.
I'm very glad to be with you and with all our viewers, new and returning. I'll be honest, I'm very upset today. We're filming a couple days after Jacob Blake was brutally shot, execution style, though he somehow has managed to survive. Last night, we got the news and didn't sleep well that 2 protesters were shot and killed. by vigilante, it looks like vigilantes whipped up. This is a dangerous time. So yeah, I'm really glad to be here. There's nothing more important that we could be doing than bringing you the Revolution Nothing Less show in these highly charged, high stakes times. But it's just to answer on a personal level, that's how I'm feeling.
Well, I'm with you on that. I mean, I'm angry, and we have some answers. These are answers that require all of you to rise to the moment, and to rise to the moment from the minute you get up from the couch or wherever you are watching this show. We have had to improvise this show. We had a certain show that we were planning. Sunsara is going to tell you more about the centerpiece of the show on the oppression of women and how that's going to take a leap under fascism. But we had a whole other thing on the convention. We're going to do a little bit on that, but when this shooting took place, and then these fascist goons showed up in Kenosha, it just drove home. It drove home what's been happening in this country and what was given permission in that convention, which was calling for revenge against black people who've been the victim of this since the beginning of this country. So we're going to get into that today. And so we're going to be improvising all the show. We threw out our script. And now we're going to be talking to you a lot from the heart, but we're going to be bringing you some information that's going to put together for you a picture that should impel you to be out in the streets starting September 5th for 60 days. And if not, then you are just going along with and normalizing a great horror. So with that, I think, we should let people know a little more specifically, now that we've got that not exactly off our chests, but said. What we're going to be doing today.
So like Andy said, a lot of our show is going to be responding to these fast-breaking developments with the shit show of a fascist carnival that was the Republican National Convention, with the vigilante white supremacist mobs that have been unleashed by this, heralding the heroism of the people who have been standing up, and this needs to go forward. So a lot of this is what we're going to talk about. We also have a couple of segments that we've been working on for a while that are digging into really a foundational question about this whole system, gets to the heart of why we need an actual revolution that has to do with the oppression of women, half of humanity, the enslavement, the degradation, the dehumanization of women, the control over their lives, their bodies, their reproduction, the right to decide for themselves whether or when to have a child, the right to abortion and birth control. These things go to the heart of the system that we live under. They're part of the reason we need a revolution. They can't be reformed away. But they also are crimes of this system that are going to whole new levels with the advance and consolidation of fascism in this country. So I'm really happy. I did an interview with the New York Times opinion writer on law, Linda Greenhouse. She was formerly, for 30 years, the New York Times reporter on the Supreme Court. And I'm going to bring you an interview I did with her a little later in the show about what she calls hurtling towards theocracy, with the changes in the courts, the judges under the Trump-Pence regime, with a particular focus on how this affects women and LGBTQ people. So this is, in a little bit, I'll begin it with a commentary that speaks a little bit more about this question at the heart of the movement for revolution that we're building. And then there'll be a few other things that we put together and bring to you from the streets, but that's our show.
All right. So as we both just said, and as you brought out in that the whole show is trying to meet the great challenge of this moment, the necessity to prevent the consolidation of fascism by the Trump-Pence regime. And our aim really is to provoke you today, to challenge you, and to inspire you to do everything you possibly can to move heaven and earth, to make the call from Refuse Fascism for protests around the country on Saturday, September 5th, the beginning of 60 days of ferocious and nonviolent struggle, ferocious in our determination and our conviction that this Trump-Pence regime must not remain in power any longer. And as Sarah just said, the Mein Trumpf Republican convention just ended. You called it a shit show, and it was that. It was an unrestrained display of America first, white supremacy, patriarchy, xenophobia, which is the hatred of foreigners, and fascism. And we're going to break this down today and in the coming weeks. But to be clear, and to be very clear, this was a declaration of war from Trump and Pence and the whole lot of them on the masses of black, brown, and Native Americans and immigrants and women and LGBTQ people, on objective truth and science, on the poor, on the elderly and the ill, and on everybody who stands for justice, on the people of the world and the survival of the planet itself. It was a declaration of war. And no, you cannot say you did not know. If you didn't know before you watched this show, you'll know by the end of the show. And no one should say that it can't happen here. It is, and the hour is late. There's still time to stop this, but there's not a lot of time. The fascists have issued their call for a fascist America. But the organization Refuse Fascism has put forward a call for a different future, a declaration about September 5th. And it reads this way: on September 5th, we must make a living declaration to the world that we are uniting, we are organizing, we are determined, we are preparing to struggle with all we've got, starting now and not stopping until the Trump-Pence regime is driven from power and the fascist program brought to a halt. So that's what we're going to get into today. And I think we should begin with talking about starting with George Floyd, 8.5 minutes on his neck, the protests that came after, the response of the Trump-Pence regime, and then Kenosha, Wisconsin.
Well, I think, all of us remember that video. I don't think any of us with a heart could ever forget watching George Floyd on the ground with a cop and cops surrounding and guarding this, where a police officer had his knee on George Floyd's neck for 8.5, 9 minutes. As people pled and could see what was happening, this light of day, it struck a chord. So people stood up in Minneapolis and people stood up around the country, and partly because of how outrageous that murder was, but also because it represented the lives of so many people who've been killed by police systematically over so many years. So I think this is a backdrop to when Jacob Blake was shot 7 times or 8 times in the back a couple days ago. This is after people stood up. This is after people across this country on a level that has not happened in generations, if ever, in this country, in small towns, in big cities, all different sections of society. And in the plain of day, these police surround, grab, and again, they shoot point blank, cold-blooded, on camera, 7, 8 times in front of Jacob Blake's children. This is too much. Now, I know there's only so much of this you can bear to watch and to see, but we have to see this. It's still going on. We're going to play this video, and then we're going to follow it with a video of Doc Rivers, the basketball coach, which captures a deep sentiment I think a lot of black people and a lot of other people are feeling when they look at this and see it's still going on even after all this struggle.
What stands out to me is just watching the Republican convention, and they're spewing this fear, right? Like, all you hear is Donald Trump and all of them talking about fear. We're the ones getting killed. We're the ones getting shot. We're the ones that we're denied to live in certain communities. We've been hung. We've been shot. And all you do is keep hearing about fear. It's amazing to me why we keep loving this country and this country does not love us back. And it's really so sad. Like, I should just be a coach. And it's so often reminded of my color. It's just really sad. We got to do better. But we got to demand better. Like, it's funny. We protest and they send riot guards, right? They send people in riot outfits. They go to Michigan with guns and they're spitting on cops and nothing happens.
That was Doc Rivers in an extremely moving statement that captures the feeling of so many people, black people and anybody else with a heart or a conscience has to feel for that. At the same time as he gave that statement, there were a number of NBA players that took a knee in Black Lives Matter t-shirts, and there were no games played on Wednesday night. By the time you see this, we don't know what kind of response there will have been in society, but there needs to be, once again, a very big response from people in the streets, from people in the communities, and from every walk of life. This has to stop. But I do want to say that this oppression of black people is woven into the fabric of this country. It is not just the original sin of this country in slavery. Every fabric of America is woven through and through with white supremacy, which is why it is still here. And even right after seeing the murder of George Floyd and then those massive protests as Sunsara was speaking, even after that, people are continued to be shot by the police. And I just want to read a quote from Basics, from the talks and writings of Bob Avakian. This is a handbook for revolution. It says, you can't change the world if you don't know the basics. And Basics 124 is that the role of the police is not to serve and protect the people. It is to serve and protect the system that rules over the people, to enforce the relations of exploitation and oppression, the conditions of poverty, misery, and degradation into which the system has cast people and is determined to keep people in. The law and order the police are about, with all their brutality and murder, is the law and order that enforces all this oppression and madness. Now, the murder of black people by the police started under slavery, continued under Jim Crow, and it continues under new Jim Crow. It is not a feature of fascism, but it is part of the roots of fascism. To fundamentally get rid of white supremacy, as Bob Avakian has said, you have to get rid of capitalism, and you can't get rid of the one without the other, which is why this show is called and is about revolution, nothing less. But I want to speak for a moment about the oppression of black people and fascism for all those people who say fascism couldn't happen here. We're a democracy after all. Look, this is not a new thing. This oppression of black people is in the soil of this country. I had the privilege of interviewing James Q. Whitman, who spoke at Revolution Books in a book called Hitler's American Model, the United States and the Making of Nazi Race Law. And Nazi race law was known as the Nuremberg Laws, which is how they determined who was to eventually go, and very quickly to go first to the ghettos, then to the concentration camps, and ultimately to the ovens. And Hitler had tremendous admiration for America's racism. And in fact, when they were writing the Nuremberg Laws, what the lawyers in Nazi Germany studied was America's race laws. And as early as 1928, 5 years before Hitler came to power, in a speech that was admiring the Americans and how their society was formed, Hitler said, the Americans, quote, gunned down millions of redskins to a few 100,000 and now keep the modest remnant under observation in a cage, end quote. This is Adolf Hitler talking about the roots of America. But then when the lawyers were working on race laws in Germany, they looked at the race laws in the United States, the Confederacy in particular, and they said, my God, that's a little too stringent. 1/64th of a person's blood being black or Negro, it makes them a non-person. That's too much. We're not going to go to 1/64th. So the point I'm making by bringing this example is, don't say it can't happen here. In a country founded on white supremacy and on xenophobia, that there couldn't be fascism here. Let's not go there. Let's actually look at the reality of what we have now in the soil out of which this Trump-Pence regime has come and what they are actually enforcing. So we're going to get a little more deeply into that, Sunsara, talking a bit more about Kenosha, where Jacob Blake was shot, and Portland, Oregon, where people have been fighting nonstop every day since the murder of George Floyd.
Look, there's two big ways that the Trump-Pence regime is escalating the fascism in the context of this beautiful uprising. One is that on top of all the state repression that was already being rained down on these protests from the beginning by Democratic governors, by states everywhere, the police, the riot gear, the tear gas, all the assault, mass arrests, Donald Trump he actually constructed and sent in a federal paramilitary force that is a military-like armed forces. He drew them out of different elements of ICE, out of elements of law enforcement, who are very, very hardened and loyal only to him and answerable only to him. He sent them in against the wishes of local governments to kidnap protesters. They were in unmarked vehicles. They were unidentified. This was a fascist escalation. So it's from the top, but it's also been from the bottom. And we see this is a feature of fascism too. The unleashing of the mob, of the fascist stormtroopers, the foot soldiers. So in Portland, just a week after the federal forces came in from Trump supporting MAGA fascists came armed and ready for battle. And they came in and street fought and assaulted the protesters for Black Lives, the protesters against fascism there. And the police stood aside and let this go down. We're going to show a video. So that was on Saturday. Just 2 days later, this is another feature of fascism. At the Republican National Convention, Donald Trump spoke. How did he open things up? He said straight up that with his Second Amendment people, he could solve the problem of protests in Portland in an hour. Listen to this.
The right to bear arms. You have the right to bear arms, especially when you look at a Portland and you see how weak those Democrats are. The governor, the mayor, how pathetic. They let them riot every night. We're saying, let us come in and solve your problem. We will solve it for you in 1 hour.
But that's not all. That night, featured speakers at the Republican convention were who? Among them was the McCloskeys. Who are the McCloskeys? They're that white racist couple who came out and waved arms, drew guns on nonviolent protesters for Black Lives. And Trump took them and he put them center stage as if they were the victims, endorsing this, giving this backing. And then, the very next night, we saw blood in the streets of Kenosha, Wisconsin. This is fascism being whipped up and unleashed. We have to recognize it for what it is.
On revcom.us, we've put up the essence of fascism. Fascism is the exercise of blatant dictatorship by the capitalist imperialist ruling class through relying on open terror and violence, trampling on what are supposed to be civil and legal rights, wielding the power of the state. All of that describes the paramilitaries, the mobilization of the guard, the way he went into Lafayette Park. And then it goes on to say, and mobilizing organized groups of fanatical thugs to commit atrocities against the masses of people, particularly groups of people identified as enemies, undesirables, and dangers to society. And think about what was at that convention and what Doc Rivers said. Who was identified in that way? And it goes on to say at the same time, and it can be seen in the examples of Nazi Germany and Mussolini in Italy, that while it will likely move quickly to enforce certain repressive measures in consolidating its rule, fascist regime is also likely to implement its program overall through a series of stages and even attempt at different points to reassure the people or certain groups among the people that they will escape the horrors if they quietly go along and do not protest or resist while others are being terrorized, targeted for repression, deportation, conversion, prison, or even execution. This is important because you saw this aspect of the program also in the Republican convention, where they were trying to appease certain groups and also to appear and to couch their repression in some nice language. And the same thing happened in Germany, and we're going to have a short segment from Noche Diaz later. I want to bring one more point out from the Republican convention, which is that at these conventions, the parties always put forward a political platform. Here's what we're standing for. This convention, in an unprecedented way, did not have a platform of what they stand for. Their platform was whatever our platform is Donald Trump. And rather than just nominate him and then he shows up at the last day, as Joe Biden did, to accept the nomination, he's on every day and his family's on, you're really seeing the question of individual rule. Now, before I get into this a little bit more, I did want to just give a caveat on party platforms. These are really things that they really don't pay that much attention to after the convention, but they do have a function. One is they cohere the party around some principles that different sections of a political party are fighting for. And then it also determines a bit of what their campaign is going to be around their issues. And some of it gets fought for after a candidate wins. But this platform is, we will do what Trump says we will do. And the reason I want to draw attention to this, because it foreshadows the ripping up of law, not by abolishing law, but by making the law whatever Trump says the law is. This is a very serious thing, because then everything is arbitrary. There's no rule book. It's a rule book that's constantly changing. And the Attorney General, the main legal officer in this country, William Barr, who's a major Trump figure in the administration and a fascist in his own right, has been busy working on all of this. And this really does mirror what happened in Nazi Germany, where Hitler became the law at a certain point. And, you know, I'm trying to hammer at this because, again, people say this can't happen here. And one of the things they say when they say it can't happen here, it's not happening here, and this is something that Bob Avakian points out in the statement I referenced at the beginning of this program, is he says that all of this, meaning the consolidation of fascism and the changing of the law of Germany before Hitler and after Hitler, he says, quote, all of this did not happen at once, but it took place within a relatively short period of time, a decade or so, and with an increasingly accelerating pace. The rule of law was not openly and formally abandoned altogether, but the law and the rule of law became the same as what Hitler and the Nazis said it was. And here, the other thing that happens is people say, well, Trump hasn't done that yet, so it's not fascism. But the point is, once he does do it, then it is fascism, and then you are really shit out of luck at that point. It's a very hard struggle when they can simply take the example that was just in microcosm in Portland and send vans in to arrest people overnight. And on revcom.us, you can read about what happened just recently in Turkey and India. Turkey, hundreds of thousands of people arrested overnight. India, millions of people stripped of their citizenship right after the re-election of Modi. So I just wanted to bring this in as one more example of the seriousness of what we are facing in a fascist regime. We talked last episode, which you can go back and watch, about how they're that he's not planning to leave office. He's told you he's going to try and steal this. They're going to limit the voting rolls, all different kinds of ways. And so there's a ferocious struggle that for him to stay in power, he is prepared to pull out all the stops, and we're seeing that right now. So before we move on to the segment of this show on the oppression of women and how that's going to accelerate under fascism and the interview with Linda Greenhouse from the New York Times, I just want to read the opening of the Refuse Fascism call for September 5th. So that stays in our heads as we see the rest of the program. And remember this, because this is what you're going to need to be part of. This is not something Refuse Fascism is going to do by itself or even wants to do by itself. This is a call to all of you watching this show to come all out on September 5th. It begins. We are speeding toward an election that Trump is already contesting and now threatens to delay. This election, if there is an election, will be a showdown over the form of rule in this country. Will the Trump-Pence regime hold on to power and be given a mandate to violently suppress dissent and criminalize protest? Will a regime that brands as their enemy all those who struggle for a better world, whether for black lives or the environment or immigrant rights, be unleashed to exact revenge aimed at destroying our ability to stand up again? This and worse is unfolding, and it has a name: fascism. The rest of the statement you can get on the website refusefascism.org or also find it on revcom.us. So we're going to get back. I'm going to come back later. We're going to have another commentary on exactly how we envision the battle from now to September 5th and from September 5th to the elections and then past the election. We're aiming for, starting September 5th, 60 days of struggle. But first, I want to bring this special segment with Sunsara Taylor on the oppression of women and the acceleration of the oppression of women under fascism and her interview with Linda Greenhouse.
After the election of Donald Trump, women began showing up at protests dressed as handmaids from the book and TV series The Handmaid's Tale, a portrayal of barbaric enslavement of women by a theocratic state. They were right to do so. This nightmare is fast becoming reality under the Trump-Pence regime. There's a very powerful Christian fascist movement in this country, built up over decades. They're packed into the military, the courts, the Congress, state houses, high finance and business, and they have a base cultivated over years, millions of them in the fundamentalist churches and schools. I'm not talking about regular Christians who just want to practice their beliefs while respecting and protecting the rights of others. I'm talking about Christian fascists who want to use the force of the state to impose their bigotry on others, to enforce biblical literalism. Back in 2016, Trump struck a deal with these Christian fascists. He couldn't have become president without them. They were frustrated by Republicans promising them over years to criminalize abortion, birth control, to take away the rights of LGBTQ people and more, and never fully delivering. They put demands on Trump, including Richard Land, one of a leader of this Christian fascist movement, told Trump to make Mike Pence vice president. And Donald Trump did. And that was just the beginning. In a little bit, I'll share an interview with you that I did with Linda Greenhouse about how far much of this has gone in the courts already, how 1 in 4 circuit judges has been appointed by Trump, how the Supreme Court is now one appointee away from cementing this direction for decades to come, how the cabinet of Donald Trump is packed to the gills with Christian fascist theocrats, including Attorney General Bill Barr, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos. This is a theme touched on in Bob Avakian's historic statement on the immediate critical situation, the urgent need to drive out the fascist Trump-Pence regime, voting in this election, and the fundamental need for revolution. Let's listen.
And with the moves by Trump's Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, who is herself a Christian fascist whose ultimate goal is to replace public secular education with schools based on Christian fundamentalist indoctrination, we can see the outline of the Trump-Pence regime version of official Christian fascist ideology. We can recognize the looming shadow of a situation where not just school children, but everyone in society will be required to pledge allegiance to a white Christian fascist America.
What could a second term of the Trump-Pence regime mean for women? Abortion, the right of women to decide for themselves when and whether to have a child, could be gone. Birth control? Next. The rights of LGBTQ people, recently and hard-fought, won? Stripped away, their lives slammed backwards. The right to divorce, even when a woman is physically abused, could be harder, if not impossible, to get. The Bible does say, after all, that women should submit to their husbands as the husbands submit to the Lord. Domestic violence and sexual assault itself, celebrated by a fascist movement as a badge of male supremacy and domination. All this at a time when women all over the world have been rising up in unprecedented ways in the history of humankind. Look at what's gone on in Latin America with the outpourings against femicide. In India, people rising up against rape and sexual assault. In Iran, rising up against Sharia law. And all over the world, rising up for LGBTQ rights. Billions of us desire to live free of these ancient, outmoded chains of patriarchy. In the next 60 days, people who don't want to see change that is enslaving, but want to see change that is emancipating, need to fight to drive out the Trump-Pence regime like the future depends on it, because it does. And on a deeper level, the freedom, the creativity, the initiative of billions of women is being suffocated and suppressed all the time under this system of capitalism and imperialism. Male supremacy is built into and threaded through the normal workings of this system. All this is completely unnecessary, but it cannot be ended until this system is ended, until it is overthrown through an actual revolution. This is what is needed, and this is what you need to get involved in the struggle to make real. That's what this show is about, the Revolution Nothing Less show, and that's what the Revolution Clubs are about. Bob Avakian, in the Constitution for the New Socialist Republic in North America, has laid out what is possible with the revolutionary state power, including around breaking the chains that bind women. Here, I want to leave you with this quote that Bob Avakian uttered over 30 years ago, but which is more sharply posed and more profoundly true today. He wrote, "The whole question of the position and role of women in society is more and more acutely posing itself in today's extreme circumstances. This is a powder keg in the U.S. today. It is not conceivable that all this will find any resolution other than in the most radical terms and through extremely violent means. The question yet to be determined is, will it be a radical reactionary or a radical revolutionary resolution? Will it mean the enforcing of the chains of enslavement or the shattering of the most decisive links in those chains and the opening up of the possibility of realizing the complete elimination of all such forms of enslavement? The future is unwritten. Which one we get, that's up to us." So with that, let's go to the interview that I did with Linda Greenhouse. By any objective standard, we are living through a turning point in the history of this country. For nearly 4 years, we have watched as what was once unthinkable, white supremacists with torches, children in cages, armed mobs storming state houses, has become normal. And now we're speeding towards an election that Donald Trump is already contesting. Today, we're going to take a look at the role of the courts and the judges that Donald Trump has appointed in all of what's afoot, and the implications of what's going on in the courts for the future lives of millions in this country and the country as a whole. So I am very delighted to have with us to discuss this somebody whose columns I've read and learned from for many years. Linda Greenhouse is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. She covered the Supreme Court from 1978 to 2008 for the New York Times. Now she writes a biweekly opinion column on law for the Times, and she is also the distinguished journalist in residence at Yale University. She's the author of many books, including Before Roe v. Wade, Voices That Shaped the Abortion Debate Before the Supreme Court's Ruling, and most recently a memoir, Just a Journalist, Reflections on the Press, Life, and the Spaces Between. Linda, I am so happy to welcome you to the RNL, the Revolution Nothing Less show.
It's a pleasure.
Great. So listen, I want to start with the question of abortion. And I wanted to ask you, for people who are not following the courts, maybe not paying that much attention, maybe taking women's right to abortion for granted, could you give us a sense of where this right is at legally, and what is the future of anti-abortion laws?
Yeah, so, for a generation now, Republican presidents have made it a point. In fact, they've been obliged, running on the Republican Party platform, to appoint judges who oppose the right to abortion and who would, the presidents believe, overturn Roe versus Wade if they had a chance to do that. And I think the fact is that there are now 5, this has been a very successful project. So there are now 5 justices on the US Supreme Court and a number of judges seated away on the lower courts where they can't overturn a direct Supreme Court precedent. So the action's all at the Supreme Court, who, if they could wave a magic wand without political consequences and with the right case and so on, would overturn the right to abortion in a heartbeat. The only thing that stands between that and now, well, one thing that stands between it, I think, is Election Day. A friend of mine once said, Roe against Wade is the gift that keeps on giving to the Republican Party. As long as it's there, it's something to mobilize around, even though poll after poll, including polls before Roe against Wade and ever since, show that a majority of the American public, men and women, want to keep the right to abortion available. So it would be pretty politically damaging for 5 hand-picked Supreme Court justices to vote to overturn this precedent that has stayed on the books since 1973, modified along the way, you might say weakened along the way, but it's still there. So the current law of abortion is that states may require women to jump through all kinds of hoops. They may require women to get mandatory counseling, which doesn't necessarily tell them the truth. They can require waiting periods. They can require all kinds of obstacles. But at the end of the day, if the woman persists, she cannot be stopped from exercising her constitutional right to abortion. So where the rubber's meeting the road right now in a series of cases is how high can those obstacles be before they become, the legal term is, an undue burden on the right to abortion. That's the current standard, the undue burden. So what is an undue burden? And the states and the anti-abortion movement is testing that every day.
I'd like to ask you from your own life experience as well. You've obviously covered the courts and the legal decisions, but now you're an opinion writer and you have an opinion. You're a very vocal advocate for women's legal right to abortion. What is your sense of the impact on women's lives? Why is that so essential? Why does that matter? And what is a world like when women don't have access and they don't have that right? I know you came of age before the right to abortion, and I think it's something young people don't have any idea what that really would mean.
Right, yeah. I mean, I graduated from college in 1968. Seems like a whole long time ago. And of course, Roe against Wade was not until 1973. And no, I knew, even in high school, there was, I remember a girl in my gym class who one day just disappeared, never seen again. She had become pregnant. She had to have a baby. She dropped out of school. What's really going on here it's not about the fetus. It's really not about the quote, right to life of the fetus. It's about the right to life of women to have the ability to control their lives without paying an enormous life-changing penalty if they happen to get pregnant and don't feel the ability at that time in their life to give adequate care to a child. It's about women's agency. And, I think what really brings this to the fore currently is what's called medication abortion, where you take 2 pills in sequence and you have an abortion. And it's only available in the first 10 weeks of pregnancy. And, people on the other side of the street really ought to be saying, that's great. We say we're really worried about these late abortions. But so here this enables women to have these early abortions. But instead, medication abortion has been the focus of enormous efforts to regulate and make it very difficult. Why? Because it gives women power. It gives women power to go to a doctor and say, please give me those pills. And you take the pills under you're legally allowed to take the pills home and take them there and have your abortion there in the privacy of your own home, under your own control. And it's the need to control women that has always fueled the anti-abortion movement. One thing that's interesting, I'll mention kind of a footnote. So during the Food and Drug Administration, which regulates drugs, has permitted women to get the pills from the doctor and take them at home. But you have to go to the doctor. You can't pick up a prescription in the pharmacy. You can't get it by mail. You have to go to the doctor. So a bunch of medical organizations and groups of patients went to the Food and Drug Administration after the pandemic had started, saying, a lot of medical offices have closed. It's very difficult these days to leave home and get on public transportation and get to one. So we'd like you to temporarily change the rule and allow doctors to deliver or mail the pills. And the FDA said no. The FDA said no, even though they're allowing that for other regulated drugs, like a drug for multiple sclerosis, a drug for a certain kind of severe depression, where you used to have to go get it from the doctor. And now the doctor can send it to you, but not for the abortion pill, which is very safe. It's been used millions of times. It now accounts for, I think, 40% of all abortions. But it's what you might call abortion exceptionalism. The rules that apply to everything else are different for abortion. It's because it's about women's lives.
Another thing that brings this out is the concerted assault on birth control and the carving out of more and more space for religious institutions. And my understanding is, and maybe you could shed some light on this, even secular employers to deprive women of their right to birth control coverage in their health care coverage. This has also been working its way through the courts and intersects. I guess I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, as well as sort of the bigger question that's part of, which is the role of religion in public society and the separation of church and state. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, we are inching, makes it sound too slow. We are hurtling ever faster toward a kind of theocracy. It's very, very disturbing, and the Supreme Court is really enabling this. So to the birth control is really a good example. So under the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, there's a requirement that employers and their employee health plans provide for contraception coverage without a copay from the woman, from the female employee. And, that's the rule. And the Obama administration carved out actual churches from that. So the churches themselves don't have to do it, but all other employers had to do it. So this was challenged, excuse me, in a case people might have heard about called Hobby Lobby. So Hobby Lobby is a corporation. One didn't know that corporations had consciences or religion, but It's a privately owned corporation with thousands of employees, owned by a religious family, and they said, "Oh no, we can't do that. We can't abide by this because that would make us complicit in the sin of contraception if our employees avail themselves of this benefit." And there was a carve out required by the Supreme Court, and the Obama administration lived with it for closely held corporations like Hobby Lobby with religious objections that said, okay, the women still have to get it, but you don't have to provide it. You just have to notify us, and we'll tell your third-party insurer that their legal obligation is to cover it, and that'll be that. Not good enough for the religious groups. So the latest case, which was decided about 6 weeks ago by the Supreme Court, the Trump administration came in and said, okay, we don't have to jump through all these hoops. We don't have to make employers ask, notify, anything. If they want to opt out for religious or what they call moral reasons to not want to provide the coverage, that's okay. Just don't do it. And they didn't even define moral. They didn't set any limitations on it. Just, put your hand up and opt out of one of the basic requirements of civil society, which is we all live by the same rules. We all live by the same rules. And the court upheld that. A case called Little Sisters of the Poor. The court had 3 religion cases at the end of the term. That was one, and I'll just mention the third one, which was requiring states, if they provide any kind of tuition assistance for private schools, they have to do the same for religious schools. They have to do the same. And that really changed the law. The law had been previously, which I didn't approve of personally, that if you provide it for the non-religious schools, you may also provide it for the religious schools. The court changed the may into a must. They must. And that's a case that's going to have huge implications going forward, in part because, as we know, in different parts of the country, a lot of these private schools were started as segregation academies, as white-only schools when integration, which of course we know hasn't moved nearly far enough in the schools, but when integration came in, parents set up these little private schools, and many of them still exist, and they're under a religious umbrella, and they're going to be able to eat at the public trough now, and it's very disturbing.
You're making me very unsettled, Linda. You're making me even more unsettled than before we began this interview.
As Michelle Obama said in her speech the other night, she said, "You may not think things can get worse, but they can." So that's just an example.
Well, Linda, I really want to thank you for taking the time, for coming on the RNL, the Revolution Nothing Less show, to talk with us, and I really hope that we can have you back sometime in the future.
Okay, you all take care.
That was my interview with Linda Greenhouse of the New York Times. Next, we're going to go to a short segment from Noche Diaz. He's the national spokesperson for the Revolution Clubs and a member of the National Get Organized for an Actual Revolution tour.
How you doing? I'm Noche Diaz. I want to talk to you about why we all got to be out there on September 5th to demand Trump Pence out now as part of the nationwide united protests that called for by refusefascism.org. Especially want to talk to you if you're someone who thinks, man, what's the big deal? Things are already pretty bad. We already have black and brown people walking around with a target on their back that can be gunned down by police. We already have a world and a society where like women are treated as like punching bags and sex objects, where you gotta fight just to love who you want to love and not be discriminated against, where like people from different countries are treated as aliens and rounded up. Things are already pretty bad, But look, if we think we've seen it all, we ain't seen nothing yet. It reminds me of like what I learned about the experience of Jewish people in Nazi Germany under Hitler. Before the Nazis came to power, in countries throughout Europe, Jewish people have been subjected to all kinds of terror, discrimination, and brutality. They've been segregated. They've been the victims of pogroms, which were European-style lynch mobs where masses of the Jewish people would be rounded up and killed. This had gone on for generations and hundreds of years. And people thought they'd seen it all. When Hitler and the Nazis came to power, people who were living in Germany thought Germany was actually not even the worst of it all. A lot of Jewish people who had left in the early days of the Nazis even looked at the first couple of years and the fact that things did not go all the way to the fullest extremes yet, and thought, maybe we've seen it all. Yeah, Hitler talks all this stuff about what he wants to do, but he can't really do that, can he? And people, Jewish people who had left, even came back in the middle of Nazi rule. And nothing could prepare people for what was to come next. It wasn't just more of the same. It wasn't just a continuation or escalation of the horrors. You went to concentration camps with death camps and ovens and gas chambers and millions of Jewish people put to death, as well as other groups of people and political opponents of the Nazis put in these kinds of death camps and targeted in this kind of way. And don't think, oh, that was there and then and it can't happen here. The history of America is a history of slavery and genocide, and the people who are following Donald Trump right now, in the millions and tens of millions, are just like the people who were following Hitler and the Nazis in those times, and who have a whole xenophobic, white supremacist and male supremacist out in the open, and a full-on fascism that they want to see imposed on people. So we cannot get lulled into a false sense of we've seen it all. We have to do everything we can to do what the German people should have done, which is mobilize in the thousands and become the millions to drive this regime out, to prevent them from being able to fully implement their fascist program. We need to start now. September 5th, we need to make a leap, and we need to grow from there all the way through until this regime is no longer in power and is not allowed to steal an election or delay an election or lock down rule using their federal agents or emergency powers. So join us September 5th in the streets, and go to revcom.us to check out Bob Avakian's statement on the immediate critical situation. To look at really what we're facing, what this has to do with the whole future of humanity and whether there will be a future, and how building this fight right now is part of, a crucial part of, building a fight for the whole thing to get to a whole liberated and emancipated future for humanity through revolution and nothing less.
We need to speak frankly now, and we need to speak from the heart, taking on board everything we've said thus far about the Trump-Pence regime and its remaining in power into next year and beyond. For the lives of millions of people in this country, for billions of people around the world, for what kind of world we'll live in, and for the survival of the planet itself. A few weeks ago on the show, I had a Reverend Brashear on the show, and we talked about the importance of standing up against this. And he said, you know, I woke up one morning and I said, I live in a country where children are put in cages. And right now there's tens of thousands of people in sweltering heat and tents in concentration camps on the border. Many are being sent back and deported right away, or after a bit of time in these camps that are nothing but COVID hotspots. Now, in El Salvador, which Trump always talks about all the killings and murders and all this kind of stuff there, all of which, by the way, and not so by the way, was fomented by the U.S. in the wars against that country and in how people were driven to this country. But now COVID is being sent to that country, and more people are dying from the COVID virus than are dying from gang violence. So we have to take all this on board, and to all who see the urgent need to stop the great danger of the Trump-Pence regime, Refuse Fascism has issued a vision statement of what September 5th must be as a beginning of 60 days of struggle. And I'm going to repeat what I said at the beginning of the show, that on September 5th, we must make a living declaration to the world that we are uniting, we are organizing, we are determined, and we are preparing to struggle with all we've got, starting now and not stopping until the Trump-Pence regime is removed from power and its fascist program is brought to a halt. Who needs to be in the streets in just a week on September 5th? Refuse Fascism said frontline health workers who have seen firsthand the human cost of this fascist regime's science-denying response to the COVID crisis. Teachers who fear their schools becoming sites of mass infection. Youth who don't know if they'll have a future on this planet. Black people must not be forced back into a new Jim Crow or even into Jim Crow terror, which is what we're seeing developing now in just the beginning stages of fascism. Immigrants whose families and communities have been terrorized, who don't know if they can make a home here. And everybody who cares about justice. Women and LGBTQ people whose right to be full human beings this fascist regime is taking away, that Sunsara Taylor and the New York Times opinion writer Linda Greenhouse spoke of. All different kinds of people, different communities and organizations bringing their own banners, their causes, their demands, all joining together with others to raise one unifying demand: Trump-Pence out now, with the determination and the recognition that this regime staying in power presents a mortal threat to every struggle for justice and to the lives of millions and billions of people, as I said. So what are we expecting this fall that we were calling for 60 days of struggle? Well, for one thing, we know they're already suppressing the vote. We've just seen in the last weeks what they've done to the post office. We know that in the states that they control, and even some they don't, they're able to restrict the voter registration. They're stripping people from the voter rolls. We know this is going on already. But there's other things that particularly younger people may know about. There's something called an October surprise, where a presidential candidate takes the power of their office and does something that then paralyzes the country or brings the country behind them in a patriotic fervor, such as starting a war. Do you really think that's beyond Trump's capability or intention? Or in this case, maybe he'll come out with some phony vaccine and say that the COVID thing is over, or perhaps it'll be some major act of intimidation and repression. We don't know. He might even postpone the election. Even the Democratic candidate, Joe Biden, said that he might do that, citing the virus as a reason to do this. Too dangerous. Although it doesn't seem that's what the more likely thing is. There's going to be a lot of struggle this fall. Even the continuing struggle that must take place for Black Lives Matter could face massive repression, and there'll be a back and forth struggle around that and maybe other aspects of the Trump-Pence program. All of this is going to be a very volatile situation. But then on election day, the votes won't all be in by the end of the day. This isn't a traditional election. The election will be going on after that as they count the votes, and he most likely won't accept if there's any defeat.
We're going to win this election. The only way they can take this election away from us is if this is a rigged election. We're going to win this election.
That's right.
But on election day itself, the Trump-Pence regime and the Republican Party have announced that they are organizing poll watchers, 50,000 poll watchers out of former Navy SEALs, Special Forces, police, and police unions. They're not going to be going there to help people vote. They've actually said we're going to send these vigilante types into the black communities to intimidate people from voting. And where will we be? Where will our side be? Will we be out there? What if we're not out there? Right now, there is a living link between the outrage in the streets against the murder of black people by the police, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, the shooting of Jacob Blake, he's paralyzed as far as we know right now, and all the others who've been killed by the police, as well as those protesters who've been run down by cars from vigilantes or shot by these counter-revolutionary, these Black Lives Matter protests. I want to go to a clip from the talk from Bob Avakian that I referenced at the beginning, the statement issued on August 1st on the critical immediate situation, the urgent need to drive out the Trump-Pence fascist regime.
If this regime is able to further consolidate its power and make further leaps in implementing its horrific objectives, this will result in a devastating setback for any attempt to resist injustice and oppression, and will very likely lead to the brutal repression and even annihilation of defenders of democratic rights and proponents of any meaningful progressive reforms, as well as any organized forces fighting for fundamental revolutionary change.
Refuse Fascism has said in this vision statement on its website, this is a moment when every cause and movement for justice needs to act on the understanding of the reality that we are at a both and moment. For crucial struggles for immigrant rights, women's rights, Black, brown, and Native people's rights, and for driving out the regime without which those rights will be demolished on a whole other level than we've ever seen before. And for the revolutionaries, we too have a moment right here where it's both and. Bob Avakian says in the statement that you just heard part of right before this, he says, the immediate struggle to oust the Trump-Pence regime from power must be approached not as a diversion from or substitute for building the movement for the revolution that is needed, but precisely as a crucial part and an urgent requirement of the overall work of building for this revolution. It's not my struggle or yours. It's both and. Look, fascism has meaning. That's what we face. You heard at the beginning of this, Trump-Pence telling you this. The regime's told you this. They've shown you this. From now till this regime is gone, every attack on every section of the people must be met with resistance, and it must build up the power and the strength of the masses of people of all nationalities in the streets in nonviolent protest, both against the outrage and to drive out the regime. The fascist thugs who've been unleashed by the Trump-Pence regime are stepping out. We've talked about that. We've talked about the lives lost. Backed by the regime, by paramilitary and police forces and police unions, they are creating the conditions for a Trump-Pence second term and beyond. Our side cannot wait any longer for our side, the side of justice, to mobilize and to act. We just can't be cheering on those on the front lines in places like Portland and wherever there's a immediate cause. This has to be everywhere. Now is the time. You will not have the organization and strength and the unity and the working relationships if you wait till it happens later on. So September 5th, just in a week, has to give a picture of this for people all over the country. They have to see what it is we're facing and what it is we're going to do about it. September 5th must orient, organize, and mobilize hundreds and thousands of people who are prepared to build this nonviolent movement in many different ways over the next 60 days, aiming for the time as soon as possible where every day people will be standing up in the streets against the regime in nonviolent protests. September, from now till then. Well, first off, if it starts beforehand, that's fantastic. But in September, people should see people all over organizing vigils, town halls, salons, plastering their cities with signs and posters. Kids, you got to chalk the sidewalks all over the place. Everything saying Trump, Pence, out now. There could be outdoor concerts. There could be videos. There could be writing. There could be artwork. You can have bake sales. There's a lot of things people can do. You can form groups of people and talk about the call to drive out the Trump-Pence regime on refusefascism.org's website. We have to give people a sense that we are organizing, we are uniting, we are determined, and we are preparing to struggle starting in October, if we haven't already, day after day, night after night, prepared to meet whatever is thrown at us. And for Refuse Fascism's point of view, we are looking to inspire and unleash this dynamic where the movement goes way beyond the reach of Refuse Fascism. But we also want to see that the stand of Refuse Fascism, which is this: in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America, is taken up by tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and millions of people. And we do want Refuse Fascism to grow and reach many more people. But the vision of October and November and beyond is far beyond that. And as I said, by October, there has to be a situation where this is going on day after day. No one can say that this couldn't lead to a situation where Trump is driven out of office before the elections. But short of that, sustained protests in October can and must lead to a situation where on election day, people don't just vote against Trump, which they should do and they must do in big numbers, but that there are mobilized people, where there are forces of thousands of people in the streets prepared to oppose with massive sustained nonviolent protest the fascist thugs and forces that we know the Trump-Pence regime is planning to unleash on election day. Leading up to that, we must support and join when we can and defend the right to vote and protest all attempts to sabotage the elections and suppress voter turnout. And if Trump attempts to postpone the election, the masses of people must pour out into the streets in even greater numbers and not allow it to go down. Or if Trump challenges the results of the election, up to and including refusing to leave office, the struggle, unity, and determination that we have forged in the streets during these 60 days leading up to the elections will need to be mustered on a whole other level of massive, again, nonviolent, sustained protest in streets all across the country. We should not foreclose the possibility that Trump will win by hook or by crook, and he is a crook. We must never forget that a fascist regime is always illegitimate, however it comes to power, and it must be met by mass protests to demand its removal. Refuse Fascism has said a fascist regime, whether come to power fair or fraudulently, must be opposed. It is illegitimate and immoral and illegal. Humanity all over the world and the survival of the planet depends on what we do. Will it be said when facing an American fascism in the most powerful country in history, armed with nuclear weapons which it brandishes, that people here could not put aside their differences to stop a great calamity? Or will this time history tell that people rose as many, acting together to stop a great horror? So with that, that closes the RNL Revolution Nothing Less show, number 23, on the 28th of August, 2020. We want to thank you for watching. We hope you spread this far and wide. Get it out on social media. Build the audience. Become a sustainer. Become a Patreon of the show. And we're going to close out with a song that we've played once before on the show by Outer National, America Goddamn. This song takes off of and actually begins with an audio clip, listen closely, from Nina Simone, who wrote a song in the 1960s called Mississippi Goddamn that spoke to against the violence that the state of Mississippi waged against black people in the South. Outer National has changed this to be America Goddamn. So with that, we'll see you next week, Thursday, this time, as usual, at 5 p.m. Pacific time and 8 p.m. Eastern time. Good night.
Slavery hasn't changed, my friend. It's just adopted a new phase.